A very warm welcome to everyone attending today's webinar. We have a few more attendees that are trickling in, so I'll get started with the introduction before handing it over to Lewis. Welcome to today's webinar titled Reboot 2.0, How's Your Digital Transformation Going? It's the third in our series, which is recapping our Social Connections 12 sessions from October this year. My name is Danny. I'll be assisting Lewis in the background, and just a few housekeeping things to go through. The first is that your computer mics or phone lines will be muted, but of course we do encourage you to ask any questions that you might have in the questions panel of the GoToWebinar program. The webinar today is scheduled for 45 minutes and will include a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Lewis.
Hi, Danny. Thanks a lot for that and for the lovely introduction. So hi, everyone. My name is Luis Suarez, and I work for Pan Agenda as a digital transformation and data analytics advisor. And I have been in this space of social collaboration and knowledge management and learning for about 17 years now, coming close to my 18th year in this field. And today what I want to do is I basically want to pose this question out in the open there for the audience to think about what's exactly the purpose of an enterprise social network. And the main reason why I'm doing this particular webinar, this particular session, as a recap as well from the Social Connections event in Vienna, is essentially try to help us refocus on what I think we may have lost track a little bit in terms of what the actual purpose is of an enterprise social network. And the reason why I'm saying that is because lately we hear lots of talk about how ESNs, enterprise social networks, help us improve the way we communicate, the way we collaborate, the way we get work done. And eventually we see also this number of different other solutions that are coming up in the space of messaging apps and chatting apps that are perhaps confusing us a bit in terms of what is really the purpose of an enterprise social network. Definitely there's a bit of in the mix there how they help us improve the way we communicate and collaborate. But if you ask me, what's the actual main purpose of an enterprise social network? It's all about the big word. It's about transformation. And as you can see from that quote from Tim Malvern, it's not necessarily about just solving problems, about getting work done, just like we have done over the last few decades. But it's actually more about how do we reinvent work? How do we think different and do different? And how we look into technology, into some of these various digital tools, as an opportunity to not only use them as enablers for that transformation, but also to help us amplify what we have been doing into building those better versions of ourselves, as Tim mentioned. So I want you to think about repurposing your enterprise social network in that space of transformation. So it's no longer about improving communications. It's no longer about improving the way we collaborate. It's about truly transforming the way we behave and the way we redesigned a new way of working. And what I'm going to be doing is essentially trying to explain why we need to refocus in that particular purpose of ESNs. And the reason for that is because there is a common objective that somehow I'm finding it really intriguing that hardly anyone talks about, and that's the one of improving employee engagement. And I want you to think as well, not engagement in the sense of whether you're having likes and comments and retweets and whatever else. I want you to think about what Scott Gold quoted as what engagement really is, which is essentially the process of building relationships. A relationship, whether it is with your customers, whether it's with your employees, with your business partners, even with your competitors. It's the opportunity of building that meaningful relationship with a particular individual or a set of individuals. And I want you to think in that context as to why do we need to improve employee engagement? And the main reason for that, and those of you who know me over the last 3 to 5 years, this is something that I have been talking about quite regularly. And that's based on a study that Gallup does on a yearly basis about the global workplace engagement. And you can see here that we're not doing very well. In fact, we haven't done very well over the course of the last 16, 17 years. Now, here you have got two different graphics. One of them on the left is the latest status report coming from 2016, right, which I encourage you to go ahead and read, because you can see here how, if you have seen the latest one that was published worldwide, which was from 2013, we have actually gone upwards by 2%. But in some countries, as you can see from that chart, we have actually gone further back than ever before. So what I want you to look is into how, if you look into some of the countries there on the left side, you see how the level of employee engagement is actually rather appalling. If you look into the cases, for instance, of Spain, Italy, Germany, Sweden, Norway, except perhaps for the US, that is at a whopping 33%, all of the other ones are very, very low. Now, if you compare that to the right side chart, what you see there is the status of the employee engagement over the course of the last 16 years, just for the US. And you can see how throughout those 16 years, there hasn't been much improvement. Now, I want you to think about what has happened in the last 16 years. That's when we had the emergence of all of these various different social digital tools. And if anything, they confirm one particular trend, that we seem to have better tools. We seem to have fancier, sexier, more up-to-the-job tools in terms of how we get work done, and yet we're not fully involved and committed into the work that we do. That means that we do have a problem. And I know that lately we're getting very distracted in terms of whether we have got new technologies, and we have got AI coming along, and we have got all of these chatbots, and we have got all of these different internet tools that are coming aboard. But at the end of the day, if you look into how involved and how committed we are, and you look into the study that Gallup does every year, and especially the one available from last year, we're not doing very well. And this is something that I find surprising, that most businesses are not looking into it, because that's like having the big elephant in the room and not wanting to face that big elephant in the room. So we need a change. And in this case, what I want to do is also introduce different kinds of narratives, because one of the things is that, if you notice, we probably have got a bit of an overuse and hype about digital transformation. It seems to be like the magic word. Everyone is talking about digital transformation. And what I want to introduce is not necessarily just digital transformation, but it's also digital adaptation. For those of you who know me for a good while now will remember how I'm not very particular and very fond of using the notion or the concept of adoption, especially on technology, because, you know, except for pets and children, you really cannot adopt things, right? And technology is one of those things that we cannot adopt. We can adapt to technology, which is different. And this is what I'm really about in terms of the purpose of an enterprise social networking tool, is how do we adapt to a new way of working? How do we adapt to a new mindset? And how do we adapt into a new way of behaviors? And by that, what I want to do is I want to introduce a concept that some of you may know already, which is known as hierarchy, coined by John Husband around 1999, if I remember correctly. And what it does is it introduces a new dynamic of how we collaborate and how we work together. Now, that's the original definition of hierarchy, as you see it on the screen. And typically, when I do this presentation, I always ask people, you know, of all of the words that you see in there, which one is the one that will draw your attention the most? And typically, I would pause for a few seconds, and people would tell me, you know, trust. They would tell me their knowledge. They would tell me results. And for me, the key message from John's definition of hierarchy is two-way, is opening up conversations, is essentially introducing a new way of interacting with people where the traditional hierarchy becomes a lot flatter, and we move into that hierarchy. We move into that opportunity of thinking that we have new operating models, social networks and communities. We have new operating models where we no longer talk about teams. And I know that lately there seems to be an obsession about using team apps, whether it's a Slack, whether it's Teams from Microsoft, whether it's Workplace, whether it's whatever other particular platform. And eventually, we're looking very narrow-minded. If you look into it, it's like groupware 2.0. Essentially, what we need to do is we need to look one step higher and start thinking of how the various different teams connect with one another, how we build those clusters. And that's when we will enter the world of those new operating models of social networks and communities. And that's essentially how we operate. If you look into it, that's exactly how you start, or how you have worked all along over the last few years, because From that traditional top-down command and control driven hierarchy, we move into this particular hierarchical way of doing things where we gather around in informal networks, or we're part of different communities of practice, and we actually get work done much more effectively by tapping not only into what we know as the strong ties, the people who we know really well, the people who are part of our teams, but also the weak ties, the people who we may not know, but we may benefit from getting to know, what they share, how they work, etc., etc. So what we need to do is, how do we accommodate within that enterprise social networking tool the opportunity to transition into those new operating models of social networks and communities? Teams are good, but they're limited. If you think about it, they're still silos. They still have got the main mission of protecting and holding one's knowledge in a smaller group, right? And what social networks and communities do is they help you open up. And one of the things that happens with that is that there is a massive mindset shift where we need to exhibit a new set of behaviors. And I'm saying a new set of behaviors, not necessarily about something completely new that we haven't heard about, but it's actually something that has been there all along and that we have neglected on purpose because we keep thinking on that team mentality versus that social network or that community mentality. And this is what I want to do with the rest of the presentation is I want to show you what are some of those various different new behaviors that we need to exhibit. And when you look into them, you will see how limited the role of teams have been so far, even today in 2017. So the idea here is necessarily saying, think about the role of the enterprise social networking tool that you may be using within your organization, and think about the particular mindset shift that needs to happen. And this is a new set of different behaviors that we need to exhibit. And I'm going to start with the biggest one, right? Adaptation. We know that change is constant. In fact, the only thing that you can do with change is delay it, right? Everything else is just irrelevant. So how quick we can adapt to that change is actually what's going to make us understand that we live in a very complex environment where before, for instance, 10, 15 years ago, we had the opportunity of working on one project with one team, with one manager and everything else. And nowadays, we have got multiple projects, multiple teams across different geographies, and the opportunity to basically have that constant need of adapting to what's coming. And not just from a technology, but also in terms of how we work. So the sooner we realize that we need to exhibit that behavior of how we adapt to change, essentially, how do we make it possible for us to have that open mind and be open to everything, right? Even though we may not be able to use it at work, but certainly that adaptation flair versus the adoption flair that has been used all along is certainly one of those new behaviors that we need to exhibit. The next one is also a big one. It's about opening up. Those of you, for instance, who know me for a while, you know that there used to be a time when everyone was talking about social business. I started other different things. And one of the things that I decided at that point in time is that how about instead of social, we go into open business, into opening up. And perhaps one of the major mantras behind openness as that new behavior that we need to exhibit is that practice, what known as working out loud. And I want to give a big shout out there to the first Working Out Loud conference that's going to take place tomorrow in Stuttgart, Germany, where a number of different practitioners are getting together to share experiences of how they are actually working out loud within their organizations. And it's all about being open. It's no longer about, do I have a need to share, or why should I share, or why would I care? This is about more narrating the way we work. It's about exposing how we work. It's about making ourselves more visible. And the main reason behind that particular openness is another behavior that is essentially transparency. John Haywood used to say that we have two different ways of managing or handling knowledge. What traditionally was known as knowledge stocks, essentially the intellectual capital repositories where knowledge was basically trapped in a process in most of the time or in a particular database. And John Hagel himself mentions as well how we need to transition into that knowledge flow, where everything works in flows, where essentially we free up information. We become a lot more open and transparent in terms of what we know. So it's no longer about the mantra that knowledge is power. It's more about the mantra of knowledge shared is power. And this is where when I mentioned the main problem that some of the messaging and chatting apps have got nowadays, where you still work in those silos, you still work of knowledge stocks versus knowledge flows. We need to keep thinking about using hierarchy as organization principle. We're inspiring that transition into a knowledge flow where information flows freely for people to make the most out of it, right? And what happens in there is that it's fully enabled by using that ESN concept, right, of the enterprise social networking tool, because it allows me to work in hyperlinks. I'm no longer working on documents. I'm no longer collaborating around documents. I transition from a document-centric computing environment into a people-centric computing environment, where what I do is I care about building trust. That's another of the behaviors that we need to exhibit. Here's the question. Do you really know who you work with? Do you really know who you work with? I mean, one of the things that I always ask about trust is that the main reason why people don't trust each other is because they don't know enough about them. They don't know about the context, about the background, about the work that they need to do, about how they relate to others, how they work with others. And when we use enterprise social networks as a way of communicating and collaborating and letting ourselves know, we give people an opportunity to build that trust with us. And that's one of the things that, you know, in the traditional world of knowledge management, it was known as social capital. And this is essentially what all of these various different social digital tools in the realm of ESNs are all about, is how do we provide that opportunity to share openly that social capital so that we can trust one another. And here's one of the big things. One of the most loaded words that we have now in terms of different behaviors and business practices is that everyone is talking about empowerment. And in the world of networks and communities, that's probably the worst word that you can use in terms of helping people understand autonomy as another behavior to exhibit. It's not about empowerment. In empowerment, you still retain the power, right? So it's not something that you're basically helping people do the things that they need to do. You still retain that power. Transition from empowerment to enablement. And this is essentially what we do with enterprise social networking tools, that we help enable people to become better and more effective at what they already do. By building those personal relationships, by being more open, by being more transparent, by thinking of knowledge flows, by trusting one another. So eventually what you do is you have the opportunity to differentiate from what you may have done in the past in terms of being more self-empowered, being more enabled to actually do your job more effectively. Now, when you combine all of these various different behaviors that I have mentioned up to now, we come along with two key concepts. One of them, perhaps one of the skills that we need in the 21st century to survive, which is another one that I'm showing now on the screen. This one is perhaps more about understanding what we have been doing that needs perhaps better improvement in there, which is about caring, right? It's about nurturing those business relationships. A while ago, I have been talking about how a while ago the New York Times basically shared an article on a piece of research that was confirming how in today's workplace we have the least number of friends than ever before in our history. So when we come to work, we no longer have friends. We have got perhaps acquaintances that are stuck in their inboxes, trying to reach inbox zero, trying to get rid of their workload and dumping it into other people's workload without not knowing anything about them, without not knowing whether they are already fully loaded or whether they are at the office or whether they are doing their work or whatever else. Somehow we forgot to care about other people and obviously their needs. And this is what enterprise social networking tools are, because when we have that openness, when we have those knowledge flows, it gives us an opportunity to nurture those business relationships. It gives us an opportunity to care about what people do. And there's one thing that happens, and this is a universal human characteristic, that if you care for people, people will care back for you. It's the same nature that if people cooperate together, they will essentially reciprocate and help you out in whatever you're doing. But it needs to exhibit this new behavior of how you build those business relationships by caring about what people do, about who they are, and what they're trying to achieve. And that leads me into one of the other behaviors that certainly, to me, is a critical skill especially in this digital world. And this is one of the things that I keep telling people in terms of, how do we differentiate ourselves when machines take over? And what do we do then, right, as they all say? Well, I want to use the opportunity here, not necessarily about using replacement, but it's more about augmentation. And with augmentation comes one of my favorite skills, which is that one of building empathy. It's about listening about what people are doing, about how they feel about certain things at work, about how you can help them overcome whatever challenges they may have or get their work done more effectively. This is essentially what's going to differentiate us from whatever is happening in terms of that technology impact in the workplace, is how do we build that opportunity to care for people and be empathic? And if you look into the whole context of enterprise social networks and communities as that operating model, this is one of the behaviors that we need to exhibit the most, because all of a sudden we will be open and visible to everything that is going on at work. And what happens in there is that in most cases, you will learn more from doing active listening than just creating content, for instance. How by stepping back and listening to what people are doing, to what people are saying, and what people are feeling about, is going to give you a better opportunity to identify how you can help further, how you can care further. And all in the context of where everything is happening out in the open, where everyone is becoming perhaps a bit more transparent than what they were in before, right? And eventually highlights what I think is exhibiting a new behavior, which is not new, because we have been doing that for thousands of years, but it's actually having that opportunity to bring back the notion of building community, of building a strong sense of belonging, right? I have read a number of different articles in the past as well that was actually confirming from research that we are living through the less empathic times in our lifetime. So essentially, when we stop caring for people, when we stop being empathic, we no longer care about belonging. We don't have that sense of belonging. We stop building those personal business relationships at work. And instead, we just focus on becoming those androids that basically, automate their job, their tasks about reaching inbox zero, or just basically focusing on their own me work versus the we work. And this is one of the things that we achieve with enterprise social networking platforms, right? That they give us a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of community. And I know, for instance, folks like Rachel Happy in the US with the Community Roundtable, she's been saying that community management is the new management, is the new leadership. And this is exactly the main reason why, because it helps bring back that strong sense of belonging. We're all social beings. We love to hang out in groups, whether you call them networks, communities, teams, crews, whatever other tribal grouping or whatever. Eventually, it's all about how do we relate to others, and how do we build that strong sense of belonging to the group. And from there onwards, what we do have is provide an opportunity for doing something perhaps that is more fulfilling as we move forward in time, which is how do we transform into that new mindset of lifelong learning. At the end of the day, that's all what's going to matter. At the end of the day, when we start thinking about how machines and how bots are going to take over all of our automated tasks that will definitely be automated, what we have got left is our ability to adapt, to change, and learn along the way. So what we're saying is this transition, and this is what I'm really hoping for enterprise social networking tools in terms of that purpose question that I asked at the very beginning, is how do we transition into becoming learning organizations? It's no longer about the transaction. It's no longer about how do we do work. It's about how do we learn at work. Learning is the work, work is the learning. That's what it's all about. That's all that matters. It's how our ability to adapt to rapid change in an environment where knowledge flows freely, where we have the opportunity to build relationships, to build a strong sense of belonging, to have that open window of visibility and transparency and awareness, and eventually keep learning. Think that that's our challenge, is how do we keep learning and how do we use those ESNs to help us exhibit those particular learning behaviors. Remember, the common business imperative. I mentioned at the beginning the problem with employee engagement. But what it is all about is that we transition into learning-driven organizations, we become more open, more interconnected, and more interdependent. And eventually we introduce a notion as well about happiness at work. And I know that some people may cringe about the whole notion of being happier, but think about how with happier we introduce as well motivation and involvement, especially involvement, is how do we become more involved? That's the actual purpose of enterprise social networking tools, is how do we become more involved with not only my own work, but with everyone else's work. Because at the end of the day, with that common business imperative, in short, it's about how do we become more human? How do we humanize ourselves and the workplace? And this is really interesting because we're finding ourselves into this fascinating challenge and opportunity of how through technology, we're being forced, and I'm going to put that in quotes, to rethink who do we want to be as humans at the workplace? What role do we want to play? And how do we want to play? So I want you to think about what is it that you're doing right now with all of these digital tools behind the firewall, right? And I want you to think about how do you plan to move and transition into becoming more adaptable to the circumstances, more open, more visible, more engaged, with a strong sense of belonging. And frankly, if you feel that you're not getting there with the current tools that you have, there's a great chance that you need to rethink exactly what the actual role of your enterprise social networking tool is, and eventually figure out if you're using the right one to help you rehumanize a workplace. And with that, we turn out for questions. So, Danny, do we have any questions coming through?
We have some great questions, some of them quite similar to one another, so I've tried to group them to cover as many as possible. The first relates to the benefits that the question is, what do we see when engagement is working well? And you've covered that quite well, which, and in my opinion, is the sense of belonging, which could be considered, though, an intrinsic benefit. So let's take it one step further. How do ESNs influence physical workplace behavior? Or, as Jack put it, what do we see in organizations and amongst people?
So this is a really interesting question because if you notice, lots of major corporations, they're actually probably forcing is a very strong word, but some of them are actually doing that. They're forcing employees to go back to the workplace, to the physical space, to the office, because they want them to connect with people, to be closer to people, to actually innovate faster because you're bumping into each other and you share all these ideas. And I eventually think that that's actually the wrong metaphor to trying to describe how you want to become more adaptable to what's happening nowadays. The idea here is that just focusing on the physical workplace is not going to be enough. Just focusing on the digital workplace is not going to be enough. You need to have a hybrid of it. And for that, I would like to recommend an upcoming book that will be published beginning of 2018 by Neil Usher in the UK. I hope I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. I will mention on the tweet stream later on the book and the author, where he basically wrote the book called The Elemental Workplace. And he actually makes a perfect use case for the blend of both physical workplace and a digital workplace and how they amplify one another. So the idea is not necessarily that you would want to ostracize remote workers by basically forcing to come to the office. Is you actually help enable them to interact with the office through digital tools, so they have an opportunity as well to contribute. And this is one of the major key benefits of using ESNs. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, I'm based in Gran Canaria, one of the Canary Islands. I've been living there now for 14 years. And the way for me to connect, collaborate, and share my knowledge with my colleagues and get work done effectively throughout all of those years has been the vast majority of the times using enterprise social networking tools. It wasn't as much of a face-to-face contact. Definitely, it wasn't anything about email or instant messaging. It was all about using those enterprise social networks. And Believe me, if there is an opportunity to make that and create that blend of the physical and the digital workplace, that book from Neil Usher is a great read that helps explain how we can make it happen as an opportunity to find the equilibrium between remote working and face-to-face working, so to speak.
Excellent. I can also offer to post the book title and author in the follow-up email that the attendees will receive tomorrow. You've talked now a lot about digital adaptation and certain behaviors we need to exhibit, but Victor wants to know, where should he start?
Well, the idea that is happening with enterprise social networking tools is the first thing that comes up is that they help you question yourself and how you work. So where you would start is questioning yourself whether you're actually doing your work in a rather effective manner. And I want to emphasize here the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Efficiency, like reaching inbox zero, you may be very efficient clearing up your inbox, but at the end of the day, you may not have been effective enough in getting your job done, right? So where do I start? I would start doing that. I would start questioning whether, am I really effective in the job that I do? Do I feel like I'm contributing into the different projects that I work with or the different groups that I work with and everything else? And start thinking about identifying, and this is something that anyone can do, is identifying whether you have business opportunities or business pain points that you would want to address. Business opportunities is all about redefining a new way of work. It's all about, instead of asking questions via email that only one or two people can see, it's about asking questions out in the open. In the ESN, for instance, right? Different, whether you have got forums or blogs or wikis or activity streams, for instance. Another example is, instead of trapping knowledge in documents, put them up in blog posts, in wikis, use hyperlinks, use the power of the hyperlink, right? And the business opportunity like that will help you redefine how you work, right? Now, you may also want to address business pain points. And I will talk here about the 3 M's, as they call it, right? Which is mail, meetings, managers. Try to address how much of a business pain point you have with each. Are you being flooded with email? Are you spending too much time on meetings? Are you being stopped in your work by management? Like, bureaucracy, like political games, like a bit of bullying that may be happening out there? If you want to address those business pain points, there's a great chance that ESNs will help you address them by becoming more visible, more open, more transparent, and helping you redefine how you want to work and how you want to relate to others and build that stronger sense of community. That's where I would start.
Fantastic. The next logical question would be, what are some of the major obstacles within organizations around digital adaptation? I guess the quick answer would be, watch your next webinar on the 12th of December. We will go exactly into that, but maybe you can give us a few ideas of what to expect in this next webinar.
That's right. So next week I'm going to be hosting another webinar about the obstacles, right? Some of the major obstacles. And in my perspective, I don't want to share too much, obviously, because otherwise people won't come up to the webinar, right? But what I certainly would want to say is that one of the major obstacles that is out there in terms of rethinking the purpose of ESNs is not necessarily about technology. It's about culture. It's about, why do we behave the way we behave? Why do we exhibit different set of behaviors at workplace than in our personal private lives, right? And why do we sort of like face all of these issues and problems when we're thinking about change and change management in terms of how do we change people's behaviors, right? To me, the biggest obstacle is that people keep thinking that we need to change people. That's the wrong dynamic. That's the wrong metaphor to use there. And the reason for that, in my experience, is that you cannot change people. What you need to do is you need to aim higher and aim at changing the system, right? About how you can provide the conditions for the system to change and then let it down up to employees, to themselves, to knowledge workers, to decide if they want to change or not with the system. So that to me is one of the major obstacles. And that obstacle is essentially highlighting how technology has never been an issue. The issue is the sociology part of the workplace. Is how do we, influence that mindset shift, that culture change? That's one of the major obstacles. And there's another major obstacle that I will talk about, but that will be on the next webinar. So you will have to come and join us.
Excellent. Some people might argue, putting it bluntly, that senior executives are another obstacle. Now, I'm not going to say neither for or against, but maybe you can tell us what the role of senior executives are in the whole process of digital adaptation.
Well, when you look into how people adapt to new ways of working, you have got early adopters. Notice how I moved from early adopters to early adapters, right? That's done on purpose. So we have the early adopters, and then we have got the second and third wave of adapters. And then there's a special group of people. I'm not going to call them the laggards, that's the last one, but there's a special group of people in the middle who are just basically waiting to be told what to do by their managers, especially higher up in the organization. So if you're asking me, what's the role of senior leadership, and for that matter, any kind of management within an organization, is, to me, is very clear, which is that one of leading by example. Saying that you're okay with the initiative, saying that you sponsor the initiative, saying that you put money for the budget so you can do all of these change initiatives, to me is no longer enough. You need to put your actions where your words are. You need to be able to walk the talk. You need to be able to actively engage yourself in using some of those various different digital tools so that you also experience these new behaviors. So you also experience what it is like working in a hierarchical model, working in a hierarchy versus the traditional hierarchy. So what I would ask, and in terms of senior management, is to start leading by example, not just with your mouth. I want to see the actions. We want to see the actions. If you are really a true leader, is now the good time to start leading by example. That's how I see the role of senior leaders.
Okay. Also, one could argue that senior executives, senior managers, leaders, in a lot of at least large corporations you could categorize them in the baby boomer or Generation Y, Generation X generational stage. The question is now, with Generation Z entering the workforce, there's a lot of barriers that may need to be overcome in the digital landscape. Can you give us any tips as to how that could be done with ESN?
If you look into it, frankly, I should start. Frankly, I've never believed in the digital divide. I've never believed into the argument about different generations. What we do have is different working styles. It's different ways of seeing how we work and different tools that we have. So what happens in the workplace when you start thinking about the use of all of these enterprise social networking tools is what kinds of working styles do you want to accommodate? From older employees, from not so older employees, and for the younger employees, regardless of whatever moniker you want to use. At the end of the day, if you ask me, they're still people. They still want to do good work. They still want to learn. They still want to collaborate and cooperate with others. So what we do with all these digital tools is essentially trying to accommodate a wider and more diverse way of interacting than picking up one or two tools to make it work. One size does not fit all, right? And I mean, if you look into it, 10 years ago, for instance, everyone was thinking about, we need to have the one and only ESN, the one that will rule them all. And 10 years later, we have learned that that doesn't work, that it has failed drastically. And it's actually the main reason why people have reverted back to using traditional tools like email or file sharing. What we need to do is we need to understand that each group is different, that each of them has got different needs, and we need to try to accommodate to as many as we possibly can. And the common ground to it all, for me, is something that helps us rehumanize ourselves, which is bringing back the mastering of the art of storytelling. If you have got older employees and they tell you that, hey, I won't use any of these digital tools because I can't type fast enough, or I don't want to be exposed like that, well, bring stories. Everyone loves to tell a story. And believe me, the older you are, the keener you will be on sharing your story. And with today's gadgets that we have, putting up audio and video to share those stories is a no-brainer. So the barrier of typing is no longer there. What we can do is we can help enable all of those different working styles by relying on stories and how people relate to stories. And there's nothing more powerful than talking, for instance, about concepts like not reverse mentoring, which is something that I really don't like, but more one-on-one mentoring, where you compare relatively younger employees with more senior employees so that they both learn how to thrive on each other's world by sharing stories. That's where it all began.
Excellent. Lewis, that is all the questions that we have today, and we're pretty close to our allocated time of 45 minutes. So I'm just wanting to tell the attendees also that today's presentation was recorded. It will be shared in the webinar page on our website, but you will also receive a follow-up email that I mentioned earlier with a link to the recording, a link to the slides on our SlideShare channel, and I can also, as I said, post the author and the book title of that book that Lewis mentioned earlier today. So with that, thanks for everyone for joining us today. Keep an eye on that webinar page for the next webinar, which we've also mentioned, titled Top 5 Challenges of Social Business Adaptation and How to Resolve Them Effectively. That's on the 12th of December, also with Lewis. And I'll give you the last word, Lewis, before ending the webinar.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope the presentation has helped you think about how do we rehumanize the workplace together. I'll see you in the next one next week. Thank you everyone for joining us.